Welcome to the Putback on SNY.TV. I'm Ian Begley, SNY's NBA insider, and we are here on SNY's YouTube channel and other social platforms where we'll be breaking down Knicks-Pacers for the next half hour or so. We've got two great guests with us today to do it. We've got Jastremski, JJ, from The Ringer, his New York podcast. I'm sure you know all about that. And you see him all over SNY, particularly Honda Sports Night, breaking all things down, including the Knicks. And then we've got Caitlin Cooper, fantastic writer fantastic writer who covers the Pacers, and she has her own Patreon basketball. She does a fantastic job breaking down the intimate details of this club on the floor. And if you want to learn about the Pacers, I said it at the start, you have to read and watch Caitlin and listen to what she's saying because she'll tell you all about it. But we're going to start here with the baseline. Baseline looking at Game 4, Mother's Day Massacre, as JJ put it last night. And this was ugly from the jump for the Knicks. They were non-competitive. They were allowing points in transition off of regular rebounds, which tells you they just didn't have their legs. And the Pacers had their way from start to finish in a rough game. And in that locker room after the game, you know, a lot of the players pushed back against the idea that what we saw Sunday was a cumulative effect of all the minutes that they played recently, all the games and all the minutes, and the idea that it was somehow Tom Thibodeau's fault. That was pushed back when you talk to the players about it. But this was a locker room that, you know, sometimes there's discussions even after losses in the locker room. This was not the case. This was a quiet locker room. This was a locker room where there was players only, I don't want to say meeting, but a conversation among players after Tom Thibodeau left the locker room, talking about what went wrong and what they needed to fix. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Knicks come out Tuesday, Game 5 at the Garden. JJ, let's start with you. The injuries and the minutes we were just talking about, is this a cumulative effect of what we've seen based on what this team has had to endure with injuries and the minutes that their main guys have had to play?
The injuries are without question taking their toll, specifically not having OG Anunoby. You look at the Knicks three-point defense. The Knicks three-point defense in the two games without Anunoby was just brutal. It felt like Indiana was able to have whatever shot they wanted Game 3 and especially in Game 4. And I know the minutes policing is going to be after Tom Thibodeau. And I understand it. Look, the Knicks have played a lot of guys, extended stretches. But look at this roster. Julius Randle is not there. Bogdanovich is not there. Mitchell Robinson is not there. Now you take OG Anunoby, and he's not in the fold. It is the playoffs. You want to win games, and I think the schedule kind of shaking out the way that it did. The Knicks giving this all-out effort in Game 3. DiVincenzo and his big effort. Alec Burks and his big effort. Being unable to hold that 9-point fourth-quarter lead. They looked like a team that was spent and that was out of gas. And to be honest, gang, I thought the effort we saw on Sunday, I thought we were going to get that on Friday. Not necessarily a 40-point game, but I thought it was going to be a margin victory for the Pacers in Game 3. Well, I was wrong. It ended up being in Game 4. But look, Tom Thibodeau has no choice. They don't have a deep team. These guys got to play a lot of minutes. But the injury aspect of all of this, I think, is taking the biggest toll on the Knicks at this point in time.
Caitlin, what we saw on Sunday for the Pacers, obviously they dominated from start to finish. Were there elements of that game that were just outliers, or were there elements of what we saw from Indiana that you could expect to see from them again in Game 5 here in New York?
I mean, I think it definitely stood out that they were quicker with the ball and to the ball than what we've seen by comparison to the Knicks over even the prior 3 games. I mean, TJ McConnell and Obi Toppin come into the game. The Pacers were up 10-4. They proceed to go on a 24-10 run with Obi Toppin and TJ McConnell scoring the majority of those points. The very first play that TJ makes, he veer switches, steals a pocket pass to Isaiah Hartenstein, throws it ahead to Tyrese Haliburton for a dunk. Versus on the other end, there was even a possession where he gets completely knocked out by a screen. The Knicks have a 5-on-4, and you're just not seeing Jalen Brunson attacking into that with quite the same fervency and relentlessness that we would have seen from him, especially in the first 2 games prior to when he suffered the foot injury. So I think that they were definitely trying to decimate a decimated team. The Knicks did not shoot the ball well. That might be somewhat of an outlier, but the Pacers made adjustments to lead to some of those outcomes. So in game 2, when they put game 3, when they put Aaron Nesmith onto Jalen Brunson, Tyrese Halliburton was guarding Dante DiVincenzo. At the start of game 4 yesterday, they had moved Andrew Nembhard onto Dante DiVincenzo, put Tyrese onto Josh Hart, and then the biggest adjustment to me is it's not just Aaron Nesmith guarding Jalen Brunson. They were being very aggressive, collapsing off of whoever was at the 4. You saw that very early from Pascal Siakam, where he's providing passive size in the paint at all times, flooding over to the strong side, really sagging off from Precious Achiuwa, from Josh Hart when he's at the 4. They were even doing that with Obi Toppin off of Alec Burks at the 4. So Jalen Brunson has a whole other body that he has to deal with as well, and that's where, to JJ's point, OG Anunoby not being there looms very large in that aspect, because sagging off of those players becomes more difficult when you have OG who's shooting nearly 40% from 3 on the season with the Knicks.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to look at another factor that has impacted this series in the way that OG Anunoby and his absence has, right? You look at overall the Knicks 26-5 with Anunoby in the lineup, 13-7 without him in the lineup. And Tom Thibodeau said on Sunday, Anunoby hadn't started running yet as he's rehabbing from this hamstring injury. He was just doing pull work. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about his status for Game 5. He's not playing in Game 5. There are 2 days between Game 5 and Game 6, so maybe it's a remote possibility that they get him back for Game 6. But, you know, if I'm betting on this thing, I'm betting that he's not going to be back this series because of the tricky nature of that hamstring injury, and obviously that could sink the Knicks. We'll see how it plays out over the next couple of days. But Caitlin, you talked a little bit about the matchup issues that the Pacers had when Anunoby went down, what they were able to take advantage of. What else have you seen without Anunoby on the floor in this series that has benefited Indiana?
Well, I think another aspect of it is at the end of game 3, because Josh Hart had committed the charging foul when Andrew Nembhard took the charge and was in foul trouble, Tom Thibodeau actually put Isaiah Hartenstein on to Pascal Siakam at the end of the game. I thought that they had found a little bit of success with that at the end of game 3, where Pascal missed a couple short roll reads when he was being used more so as the screener. They put a smaller defender on Miles Turner. For whatever reason, they didn't really want to look at that so much in game 4. That's probably something that if I were the Knicks, I would want to explore a little bit further in game 5, but OG makes that more feasible, because the idea of maybe putting him on Miles Turner and letting him switch out on screens to Tyrese Halliburton. Tyrese has looked a little bit more spry attacking switches, but that's a little bit different when you're going against somebody who I consider to be one of the most positionalist defenders in the NBA, and OG Anunoby. So they don't have quite that same degree of versatility, even though if I were the Knicks, an adjustment I might look to make is actually assigning Josh Hart to Miles Turner from the start of the game and putting Hartenstein onto Siakam, so that they're taking away some of those mismatches that we're seeing Siakam exploit, especially in the second quarter last night.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how Tom Thibodeau and co. adjust for Game 5. But JJ, bottom line, if there's no OG Anunoby back before the end of this series, can the Knicks win the series?
So I still think the Knicks have a chance to win this series, because Jalen Brunson has been this special, incredible talent all year. And I understand that he's compromised at the moment. We're talking about that foot. He hasn't looked the same since he's come back from the foot injury. Played brilliantly second half, Game 2. How much of that was adrenaline? Wasn't the same guy in Game 3. Clearly wasn't the same guy in Game 4. But this is a guy who loves to prove the doubters and the haters wrong. And that has been kind of the mantra of this Knicks team. Now, the odds makers, for what it's worth, they now have Indiana, who was a heavy underdog coming into this series, as a slight favorite going into the series in Game 5. The Knicks are a slight favorite in Game 5. Take that for what it's worth. I think Brunson has to be incredible. And I know that's unreasonable, and I know that's unfair for a guy who's not 100% right. And a whole lot of these Knicks guys at the moment are not 100% right. But I think it's the element of Brunson being great, this Knicks team feeding off the Madison Square Garden energy, and maybe it's the inexperience of the Indiana Pacers coming home to roost. That, to me, is the pathway for the Knicks to go and win this series. But let me make this clear. If the Knicks lose Game 5 on Tuesday, and Ian, I said this with you when we did our hit Sunday from Indiana, I think the Knicks are cooked in a Game 6. I think they made the best effort to win a game on the road was Friday. That game was there for the taking with a 9-point lead. I think if Indiana wins Game 5, they're having a party on Friday night.
That Brunson foot issue, I mean, he's not going to tell you about how much it's impacting him, but everybody who's watching these games could tell you that it's not the same player. And that foot injury, it's affecting his lift. It's affecting his ability to get by guys off the dribble. And I think it's more significant even than, it has been kind of talked about by coaches and by the listings that the Knicks are doing before these games, where he was questionable before game 3, not on the list before game 4. I think it's really bothering him. And then you look at also his hand and his wrist. You see how heavily it's taped. I think those are lingering injuries there too. So he's banged up. He's not going to talk about it, but it's certainly impacting what you've seen the last couple of games from Jalen Brunson, and the numbers are there too. Caitlin, for you look at first 2 games of this series, last 2 games of this series. Have the Pacers done anything differently on Jalen Brunson? And if so, what have you seen?
I mean, the biggest change obviously was putting Aaron Nesmith on him to start game 3. If you look at the numbers over the last 2 games, he scored 33.8 points per 100 matchups against Aaron Nesmith compared to 52.3 for the first 2 games against Andrew Nembhard. Nembhard's their best on-ball defender, but for Jalen Brunson, he's very small, but he creates a lot of separation. So you do need to have more length on the contests. That's what they've done with Nesmith, but Nesmith isn't guarding him by himself. It's like I mentioned, they're having a roamer off of Precious Achiuwa, off of Josh Hart, even a few possessions off of Alec Burks, stationing that player in the lane. So for the Knicks, if Jalen Brunson is limited and he isn't 100% himself, it's what are you doing to reposition that roamer in the paint? What can you do to clear some of those driving lanes for him so he's not having as high of a pickup point? Maybe it's Precious Achiuwa being an even more explosive cutter. He had a couple of those plays early on in the first half. They didn't get to that enough. Maybe he's going to more uphill dribble handoffs so that he can be more of a floor spacer. I think they're going to have to get more creative to deal with how they're helping Jalen Brunson be closer to the player that he was. Certainly very similar to what the Pacers were having to deal with after Tyrese Haliburton suffered his hamstring injury earlier in the season as well.
Right, that's a really good point. We were all talking about Haliburton and how he'd been struggling after that hamstring injury, similar to Brunson here. And you mentioned it, Caitlin, before we came on. It would just be great to see both of these teams at full health, particularly both of the point guards at full health. I think it would be, a fantastic series, fantastic theater. It's already been great theater, but you just hope that everybody's healthy when you get to this stage. It's never really the case, but it would be fun to think about what it would look like if everybody was healthy. And JJ, you look at Brunson, you've seen him throughout the playoffs, throughout the season. What's your concern level when you see what he's doing over these last couple of games?
Oh, you have to be concerned. This is a guy who was able to do whatever he wanted in the first 2 games, even coming back off that injury at Madison Square Garden. Game 1, brilliant, carried them in the first round series against Philadelphia. And you could notice it from Jump Street in Game 3. He didn't have that hop. A lot of those shots around the basket that were automatic for Jalen Brunson for good chunks of this season were not going in, and that's where you have to question what kind of physical shape he's in. We all know this, though. He's going to fight through it. He's not going to make excuses. I walked into the media room yesterday, Ian, and you asked him the question, how are you feeling? He looked you dead in the eye, and he said, I'm fine. Now, I love Jalen Brunson. I don't think he was being 100% truthful, if we're being honest. But, hey, he's not going to make excuses. I love that about him. That's why New Yorkers love this guy so much. He fights, he scratches, he claws. And that's what I think he has to do in Game 5, in Game 6, and in Game 7. That's how the Knicks are going to win. Like, Indiana, Caitlin, you brought it up, and I think it's a brilliant point. 10-4 yesterday. They go to McConnell and Toppin, and those guys are electric. They have answers, the Pacers, off the bench that the New York Knicks at this point in time do not. The Knicks are not a particularly deep team. They're not going to get that sort of infusion. So if we're wondering where the infusion is coming from, listen, maybe Jalen Brunson's got to get some voodoo magic. Maybe Kobe's doctor's got to fly in to get anything going for him to make the body feel a little bit better. But those Villanova guys, right? They go, the Knicks go. Case closed. And you look at the shooting percentages for Brunson, for Hart, and for DiVincenzo in Game 4. Hey, if we're talking about shooting percentages like that for the Villanova boys in Game 5, the Knicks are dead. Game 6, the Knicks are dead. Those guys have to be great. It's unfair. It's unreasonable. They've played a lot of minutes. It's been a lot of basketball, but that's the pathway for the Knicks winning. Simple as that.
I think also defensively, if you can slow down Halliburton somewhat, I think give yourself a chance. And Dante DiVincenzo, we saw him defend Halliburton really well game one, but as the series has gone on, Halliburton's really gotten going. Caitlin, what have you seen differently from Halliburton earlier this series to now? Is it simply health or is it other elements too?
I thought definitely in the first two games that based on how he was operating within certain actions with Dante DiVincenzo top blocking him, he was turning down some of the turn screens that the Pacers would use for him. He wasn't being as active. Also, since the All-Star break, have been using him very heavily. If he gets hunted in mismatches, he will use show coverage. You could see in those first two games. Sometimes he was a 6'5" guard playing in drop because he couldn't get up above the level of the screen. I think in these past two, especially game three, that's the most spry I've seen him look since he came back from the All-Star break and the injury. I think that the one thing that predominantly works against him, which you saw the Bucks try to do at the end of their series, is they're like, hey, we're just going to switch everybody. Even if that means we're switching Brook Lopez out there, maybe we'll go switch to blitz. Switch coverage is more effective against Tyrese because sometimes he can kind of spin his tires on the perimeter, although we have seen him drive some of those switches. And that's, again, where some of the OG Anunoby stuff looms large because it would be easier to switch some of the ball screens with him. But I think at some point, you probably maybe even just lean into that a little bit more, although I know Tom Thibodeau isn't the biggest fan of switching and prefers to keep a rim protector around the basket. I believe the Knicks ranked 29th in switch frequency during the regular season. But we have seen Hartenstein be able to hold up on a few of those possessions throughout the series.
One thing I've noticed with Halliburton, game one, obviously, it's this welcome to the playoffs moment. I know they played Milwaukee in round one, but it's Madison Square Garden. It's the big stage, and you got so many great contributions from the Indiana Pacers in game one. You didn't get that from Halliburton. He's gotten better and better and better as this series has gone along. You see him talking some smack. You see him playing with a lot more swagger. Maybe it's the idea of feeding off the home crowd and playing in these nationally televised games. But the Knicks' strategy on Tyrese has been pretty simple. They dared him to shoot the basketball. And what he was able to do in game three and in game four is he was knocking down that outside shot. And with the Knicks not having OG Anunoby, they don't have the same sort of defensive flexibility that they had going into this series. And you can look at Halliburton's shooting percentages. Listen, the Knicks are going to continue to let Halliburton shoot the three. And if he's going to hit shots the way he did in Indiana, he will continue to be a massive problem for them because we know he can get to the rack and create and do all the things that he's physically gifted in doing as far as being this super freak of a point guard and of an athlete. But when he's hitting that outside shot, Knicks are going to dare him to take it. Can he knock it down?
Yeah, well, when he has 3 seconds to line it up, as he had a couple of times in Indiana, he's going to knock it down 10 times out of 10. So the Knicks, I think, need to do a better job defending in transition. But for the putback, we are now in podcast form, so you can catch us here, but you can also catch us wherever you download your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, wherever. So keep an eye out for us there. But now we're going to get into Rick Carlisle. The big comments after game two. He certainly caused a stir here locally. I don't know, Caitlin, if you saw the New York Post back page, the creative portrayal of Carlisle that was on the back page after his comments game two. But hey, you look at the officiating since, and I think it's been a different story. So that was $35,000 well spent. I think if you're Rick Carlisle and you're the Pacers, Caitlin, did you think the comments shifted the way the series has been officiated in general? You see a difference in the officiating games one and two versus 3 and 4?
I mean, I will say that I think that the play where Aaron Nesmith was in Jalen Brunson's landing space last night was a foul by any definition. I think that there's been missed calls on both sides. Certainly there were at the end of game two. I can understand where some of the frustration from Rick Carlisle goes. And there's also the added benefit that when you go out on the podium and do that, your guys know that you're going to go out there. That's perhaps has a galvanizing effect as well. I think that the one thing that does stand out, though, is that the Pacers tried to have Aaron Nesmith guard Jalen Brunson at the beginning of February. On February 1st, he was his primary. Aaron Nesmith ended up fouling out. A few days later, when they played them again, I believe on the 10th, that's when they ended up pivoting to Andrew Nembhard, and Nembhard had recently been reinserted into the starting lineup, predominantly because Nesmith was picking up a lot of fouls at the point of attack. So the fact that he's been able to stay on the floor without fouling out, really showing his hands against Jalen Brunson, if you're going to make those types of comments and you think that the game might be officiated more in your favor on the home court, that definitely did benefit Aaron Nesmith, who's known for being able to rack up fouls, especially when he's defending smaller guards.
There's no doubt this series has been officiated a little bit differently, but that shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, we are at home in the postseason. You're traditionally going to get the better of the whistle. And we can't ignore the fact that the Knicks clearly got the better of the whistle in game one, specifically the acting job that Dante DiVincenzo did at the end of the game. Now, Carlisle playing the big market, small market card. Listen, I wasn't a big fan of the comments, but I know what the coach is doing. It's full-fledged gamesmanship. And do I think that his team back at home got some calls that went their way in game three? 100%. There were a couple of blown calls in game four, but I don't want the narrative of game four when you basically lose by 40 points to be officiating, because I didn't like the narrative being talked about when it comes to officiating deciding a game in game one or game two. I thought that was overblown. And at the end of the day, even in game three, where I thought there were a couple of missed calls that went against the Knicks, if I'm not mistaken, the Knicks missed a couple of free throws late. Brunson missed one late. Hart missed one late. Nembhard hits the shot, and you had a 9-point fourth quarter lead. So I don't want to hear about officiating. And when you get your rear end kicked like they did, guys, the last thing any Knicks fan should be doing, waking up Monday morning, going into work, talking about the game and saying, oh, well, we didn't get this call, we didn't get that call. The proof is in the pudding. That game was as ugly as can be. And, hey, it's 2-2. Want to tell me Indiana got a better whistle at home? Knicks got a better whistle at home? Okay, series on. Let's go.
With that, we are going to our associate engineer, social media, Matt Spenley. Matt Spenley has a fan question for us. Mr. Spenley, what's up?
What's up, guys? How we doing? Okay, Michael on YouTube is asking, do you expect Deuce or Precious to start the fifth game of the series? So obviously we've seen Achua into the starting lineup with OG's injury. I think Deuce's play has left something to be desired as we've gone on here. But Ian, for the next game, we also saw Tibbs start game 4 in the second half with Deuce on the floor, which we don't see him do a lot, make those sort of halftime adjustments with the lineup. Do you think that they make a lineup change for game 5, and how do you anticipate the rotation playing out as they continue to weather OG's absence?
Yeah, obviously you lose a lot offensively, Precious versus McBride, but with McBride shooting it the way he did game 4, you really didn't get a lot back. Yeah, I wonder if it's McBride or an Alec Burks that they go to, assuming no OG, which there won't be OG Anunoby. They have had issues offensively, Achua, but he was probably their lone source of offense early on in that first quarter of game 4. With that being said, yeah, I would expect them to at least strongly consider some kind of adjustment here with the lineup, McBride or Burks, and we'll see how they play it. But certainly Siakam has been difficult for them with Anunoby, without Anunoby, and becomes even more so if you're taking Achua off the floor.
Fair enough.
JJ, what are your thoughts on McBride, what you've seen from him so far this series?
So it's been disappointing. There's no other way around it. McBride was instrumental in the Knicks beating Philadelphia. He was so good in those first 2 games at home. He hit so many big shots, and he has not given the Knicks the same sort of production so far in this Indiana series. And if you're looking for another source of where the Knicks can get a little bit more offense here to help out the Villanova boys, it would behoove Deuce McBride to get going here. Now, as far as the question regarding inserting him into the starting lineup, I don't necessarily like it, because I want to be able to guard Pascal Siakam the best you possibly can. And to me, if you have Achua out there for those first couple minutes, you can body him. The issue with Burks coming up, putting him in the lineup, Ian, they need his offense coming off the bench. I can't believe I'm saying this, because Burks was a guy who was not playing at all until the Knicks had this just insane amount of injuries going into game 3 in Indiana. But I like the idea of Burks coming in off the bench and giving you instant offense. And with Deuce, he's come off the bench all year. Ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm keeping the starting lineup as is.
The one thing we haven't really talked about is the rebounding, and that was an area where I think coming into this series, it was logical to expect the Knicks to have a sizable edge, and that hasn't been the case. And part of that is, I think, Isaiah Hartenstein maybe not positioned as he usually is to get rebounds, maybe just not having a lot of gas in the tank, whatever it may be. But yesterday after the game, Hartenstein was taking his jersey off. He was using one hand to take his jersey off because the other hand, the shoulder was bothering him a lot. And he said that the x-rays on the shoulder were negative, but he also talked about feeling numbness in his hand after he took that hard fall on his shoulder in the first half of Game 4. So again, not using his other hand to take off his jersey and just looking pretty uncomfortable. He said he'll be fine for Game 5, but when you hear nerve issue, obviously that sounds the alarms a little bit. So the Hartenstein injury could be yet another one that the Knicks are going to be dealing with, added to the list of Jalen Brunson's foot and then the guys who will not be playing. It's just the list goes on here. And if Hartenstein is compromised, I mean, you would think that Miles Turner can continue to have a big impact on this series. I'm curious, Caitlin, what have the Pacers done as far as what you've seen to kind of neutralize the Knicks' rebounding edge? What have they been successful with?
I think especially at the start of Game 4, you saw Pascal Siakam being very active to turn and spot where those players were before sending the box outs. There was a 2 or 3 where he was very aggressive and had people close to the stanchion. The Pacers were not a good rebounding team during the regular season. After they acquired him, I think they moved up to 24th in opponent offensive rebounding rate. So it's about, some of it for them is about more chest-to-chest box outs rather than spotting the ball off the rim and doing it that way. And then also, like, I honestly just think some of it was going back to the fatigue issue. Like when you look at Hartenstein, one of the rebounds that Miles Turner got in the first quarter, it was like one of them was stuck in wet cement and the other one had completely fresh legs. I mean, that's literally what it looked like. So I think that that's where some of the advantage comes from. But it certainly going into this series wasn't something that I thought was going to be particularly close in that particular battle. I thought that the Knicks would pretty easily win the possession war against the Pacers.
Yeah, one of the surprising elements of this series through 4 games. Matt Spenley has another fan question. Matt, what's up?
What's up, guys? All right, Caitlin, this one's for you. This is a fan question from me. As you're watching the series, and obviously you've watched the Pacers all year long, we know with OG out, the Knicks have incredibly limited options, but I wanted to go kind of back to the fan question we were asked about the lineup and just, do you see any other way that the Knicks can effectively defend Pascal Siakam? Because Josh Hart clearly is not the answer. He's an excellent defender, but despite his rebounding prowess, he's still giving up a ton of size. So with the Knicks' options, do you see any other way that they could more effectively defend Siakam than they have the past couple games?
Pascal Siakam isn't Joel Embiid, but when I watched the Knicks play the Sixers in the prior series, I felt like some of their double teaming was fairly messy. So you're now seeing them have Josh Hart guard him in single coverage a lot. That's what they've been more willing to live with. If I were them, I think the Knicks have 2 options. They could test Siakam as a playmaker and start sending some of those doubles. He hasn't seen as many doubles in this series. Maybe he's a little bit rusty with that and he's not making the same kickouts. Or it's what I said at the top of the show. I might give a lot more consideration to cross-matching it, putting Hartenstein on that matchup, and then putting Josh Hart onto Miles Turner. That might marginalize Miles Turner somewhat as a screener. And then you're using Pascal more in the short roll, and he missed a couple of those reads at the end of Game 3. For whatever reason, Tom Thibodeau didn't want to look at that again. I think he said ahead of the game that he mainly did it because Josh Hart was in foul trouble. But I would definitely look at that, especially in the minutes when Pascal's out there with Isaiah Jackson as well, because Isaiah doesn't have a very well-developed post-game where you're going to then be posting Isaiah against Josh Hart or whoever the other defender is that they're cross-matching with.
One of the big players in this series, too, has been TJ McConnell. I think he was plus 20 in the first half, plus minus. I think he was in for 11 minutes yesterday, Game 4. But even taking that crazy number out of the equation, he's really made an impact in this series, both on the floor and when he was on the bench. Caitlin, what have you seen from McConnell? Is there anything different than what he's shown you over the course of the regular season? Because he's really, really made his presence felt in these first 4 games.
You know, Game 3 was an outlier performance from him and Obi, and that the bench didn't give the starters a lead going into the fourth quarter. The starters had to dig out of, I think, a 4-point deficit when they were all back on the floor. And with TJ, it's a cliche, but it's a make or miss league, right? Because in Game 3, he missed some of those shots that he makes and Pogo sticks into in the non-restricted area of the paint, and that led to 94-foot fast man break or one-man fast breaks for Josh Hart going in the opposite direction. Those were some punishing minutes during that stretch when TJ was missing some of those shots. When he's making them and the Knicks are having to take the ball out of the net, they weren't getting some of those easy opportunities, which was compounding what was already a really poor offensive performance for them last night. TJ, I think, confounds a lot of people because he actually led the NBA in drives per 100 possessions. He's very good at staying lower than his defender, and as Tyrese Haliburton has referenced many times, TJ wants to attack baseline, and that's what most defenses are geared to lead you towards. So then if you force him middle, that's where most players want to go. So he's just so effective out of pistol. He might be one of the best guards at that. It's very hard to keep him out of the paint. And you could see it even yesterday, attacked out of stack action. And it looks like he's the music of Flight of the Bumblebee with his driving angles. He's just always changing direction, and it makes it very hard to stay in front of him, even with somebody who's very, for the most part, I think Deuce McBride's been very tenacious for the Knicks at the point of attack, but TJ can be a load. You can duck under him, but sometimes even his handle, he can use that to induce overs. He's trickier than I think people give him credit for, especially with the ball in his hands.
He's a winning player. He's a winning player, gang. I knew going into this series, the Knicks fan by 4 games was going to absolutely hate TJ McConnell. And I say that in a complimentary way because he is perfect as a backup point guard in this NBA. He gets to the rack. He knows how to distribute. He just oozes winning intangibles all over the place. Then, I don't think he has the same sort of ceiling as a guy like Jalen Brunson. He's obviously a different type of player, but he's another one of these guys that's kind of been doubted his entire career, going back to his high school days, playing at Arizona, playing well in Philadelphia, and he's obviously found a home backing up Haliburton with the Indiana Pacers. And I know from a Knicks perspective, I hate when he's on the floor. He makes me uncomfortable. He makes me nervous. He has killed them in 3 of the 4 games in this series. So he's a problem. I knew he would be going in, and that has absolutely lived up to my expectations.
Yeah, he's been hurting them for a long time. I think he had a triple-double in his 3rd year when he was a Sixer against the Knicks, and he's just been a pest against the Knicks and probably every other team for his whole career. Just another impactful performance for TJ. But right now, we're going to go to series predictions. We want you guys to look into your crystal balls a little bit and how you see this shaking out. Caitlin, we talked about it before the show. So let's go on the premise that OG Anunoby, let's say he's out for Game 5, out for Game 6, comes back at less than 100% if there's a Game 7. In that scenario, how do you see things shaking out?
If he's out the next 2 games, I think I would probably lean towards Pacers in 6, especially if the rest of the roster continues to look as depleted as they did yesterday, which I said at the top before we hopped on here. I think that the matinee schedule definitely worked in the Pacers' favor by comparison to the Knicks. They're more adept and used to playing their very up-tempo style, playing deeper with only 1 day off and then playing in the afternoon. I think that did disadvantage them to a degree, but with the way that Jalen Brunson looks, with not having as many options to move who the roamer is in the paint, I think it's going to be hard for the Knicks. And I just, from a fan perspective of just somebody who enjoys basketball, I truly do wish that we would have gotten the best of this matchup from both teams.
Amen. And those looking at this as a referendum on Team USA, I'm sure they would have wanted to see both Haliburton and Brunson healthy. But JJ, what do you say? OG out for the next 2 games, coming back less than 100%, Game 7. How do you see it shaking out?
I'm going to assume, Ian, he's out altogether. And I know after what we saw in Game 4, it's very difficult to go and make the case for the Knicks to win this series. But that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say that they feed off the Madison Square Garden energy. I'm going to say that the guy who has been one of the most special stories in all of basketball adds one last chapter to this remarkable 23-24 season. And maybe this is just me trying to paint an optimistic picture. Maybe this is me with the New York blinders on. I just don't think this Knicks season is going to end in a predictable way. I think they're scratching their clawing like crazy. And I think if we see a 7th game and it's played at Madison Square Garden, I think the inexperience of the Indiana Pacers could end up being problematic. So again, it's a cop-out answer. If the Knicks are winning, they're winning it in 7. And I think if Indiana wins Game 5, Game 6 will be for the Pacers. So it's a hedge answer. I picked Knicks in 6 at the outset. I'm calling it audible now, though. I'm going to say Knicks in 7.
I like the hedge, and no matter what, we're going to hear your analysis, your takes on the New York podcast that you host on The Ringer, and I highly recommend Knicks fans, NBA fans in general, to subscribe to Caitlin's Patreon, which is Basketball She Wrote. You're going to learn something. You're going to learn many things about the game, so keep an eye on that, Pacers or otherwise. That'll do it for us on the Putback today. We will be back with you at some point, maybe later this series, maybe going into the Eastern Conference Finals, maybe a season wrap-up. We don't know yet. We'll see what happens. Game 5 Tuesday, and we will take it from there. But be sure to keep an eye on Honda Sports Night every night for your Knicks coverage between now and then.